So, hello everyone and welcome to CTM Festival's Research Networking Day in the edition of 2025. My name is Anita Jóri and I'm one of the curators of the Discourse program, and I'm also a research associate at the Leuphana University Lüneburg, and I have the honor to host this afternoon. So the Research Networking Day is an exchange platform for students and researchers from different graduate and postgraduate programs in the fields of audio, arts, media, design, and related theoretical disciplines. And today we have 9 students, scholars, and artists/researchers from a variety of fields of study and approaches, and they're going to present their research touchings on 3 different themes. So this year, exceptionally, we didn't announce a huge big theme for the festival and also including in our call for papers. Instead, we have 3 different topics, which you can also see here. The first topic will focus, or the first module will focus on affection. The second one on resynthesizing the traditional, and the last one is working with the topic of anarchy in the AI. So the 9 presenters today all applied for our call for papers, and now I would like to also thank to those of you who applied, but you were not selected for being here today. I have to say that every year we get more and more applications, which is really amazing to see. The Research Networking Day always works with collaborators, and as you can see here again on the screen, this year we have the Berlin University of the Arts as collaborator, the Berlin-based network and project space Trust, and we have a new cooperation partner, and we are very happy to have them on board, the Freie Universität Berlin. And of course, a big thank to these collaborators and institutions, because I have to say without them we wouldn't be able to hear today. And I would also like to mention that this year's edition of the Research Networking Day is kindly supported by the SHAPE platform, so also thanks a lot to SHAPE. And if I'm talking about gratitude and thanking to different colleagues and to different institutions, I would also like to highlight 2 dear colleagues of mine, Tajsa Raplinski, and I would like to thank her for her help in selection and also organizing this whole afternoon. And another person who is really important here also on site is Valeria Baudo. Thank you so much, Valeria. You are the best for the production of today and also organizing the whole afternoon. Now I'd like to introduce you these 3 different modules and 3 different topics we are going to discover during this afternoon. And as I mentioned you, the first one is going to focus on affection. So this theme explores new modes of relationality that are at once intimate and social, dismantling conventional divisions of public and private, and embracing ideas of interdependence and the richness of multi-perspective experience. Affection is also the theme of this year's CTM Radio Lab Commission, so I'm sure you have experienced that throughout the week. And this module will be hosted by Jovana Maksić from Trust. The second theme, Resynthesising the Traditional, will be hosted by Matthias Pastierny from Berlin University of the Arts. And this theme draws on resynthesizes, a technique from computer music where sounds are broken down into fundamental elements. So this session will examine how artists and researchers might explore cultural heritage by avoiding traps of self-exoticism or exoticism in general, often shaped by stereotypes and mainstream cultural narratives. Also to see and view culture not as something static or untouchable, but a fluid and an open to reinterpretation and change. So Resynthesising the Traditional is also the name of our artistic lab at CTM 2025, hosted by Suzy Ibarra and Stas Sherifulla, including 8 artists working on this theme and who will also present their findings tomorrow. So highly recommended also to come tomorrow at 2 p.m. and see what was the result of their research throughout the 10 days of the festival. Last but not least, we have the third topic of this afternoon, anarchy in the AI. And I have to say AI in general is really a dear topic for our festival, and you could already visit, I think, some of the panels throughout the weeks, and we also had a book presentation related to this topic. But specifically this module this afternoon will focus on imaginaries and potentials of alternative AI futures in sound marked by wildness and anarchic qualities rather than standardized middle grounds. This module will also challenge dominant narratives and open up possibilities for transformative technological developments that are more inclusive and creative to the diverse complexities of human and non-human worlds. So this module will be hosted by Miriam Ackermann from Freie Universität Berlin. And after introducing these three topics, I would like to share a few ideas about this afternoon, how this will actually really look like. So as I mentioned, we will have these three modules, about 90 minutes each of them. And we have three presentations in each topics. The presenters will have only 10 minutes to present their ideas. I know it's a very short and condensed time to talk about research findings and also artistic practices. And then it will be followed with a 5 minutes very short Q&A between the hosts and also the presenters. And then later on in the second half of each module, you will also have, all of you who are here, the audience, the possibility to ask questions also from the presenters. So in the second half, you all will be involved, and feel free to keep your questions also for later and save them. So now I think we can move on to the first module, affection. And I'd like to introduce the host of this session, Jovana Maksić, who is a neuroscientist who has done extensive laboratory investigations. Her research delves into the spectrum of the interplay between culture, cognition, and sociality, shedding light on the nuanced evolution of these aspects in our world. She also maintains and moderates a trust community in Berlin, a very important one, highly recommended to check them out, an experimental think tank exploring collective ways of reading, writing, and researching. Jovana, over to you, and thank you so much for taking over the moderation of the first session.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Anita, for the lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be here today and to have a very fun discussion with the participants and also with the audience. So please make sure to engage with the topics and just write down any questions, because at the end of the session, we're going to have a big Q&A. So first, I'm going to introduce Lucy Havelock, who is going to be the first presenter of this module. Lucy is a composer, improviser, and saxophonist whose work bridges contemporary music with everyday themes, including memory, identity, and sensory experiences. Havelock grounds her work in collaboration, improvisation, and an exploration of microtonality and timbre. Her dedication to inclusivity in the arts is evident in her sensory-friendly music theater piece, In Two Minds, developed as part of her final university project. Performed with Ellie Stamp, it delves into the concept of experiential duality and reflects her research into disability and representation within contemporary music. Recent work includes collaborations with prominent groups such as the SAFA on their youth music scheme, and performances with ensembles like the Chimera Ensemble and the ARC project. In addition to her composition work, Havelock is an accomplished saxophonist with a growing performance portfolio. As chair of the Chimera Ensemble during the 2021 and 22 academic year, she contributed significantly to York's musical community, ultimately receiving the prestigious John Painter Prize upon graduating. She has performed as a soloist in venues such as the St. Paul's Hall, Huddersfield, at Sarah Markham's Saxophone Day, where her talent as an improviser and solo performer has continued to shine. Recognized for her progress throughout her undergraduate studies, Havelock was awarded the Ralph Markham Achievement Award in 2022. So please welcome Lucy now to the stage.
Hi, so I'm Lucy, and yeah, this is my practice research project, A Dance of Agency, the Constitutive Role of Care in Extended Improvisation. So sort of begin and develop a little bit on that introduction. This is sort of, it's within my, it's an exploration within my practice. Most commonly now, my practice is performing sort of extended duration pieces. Often that's microtonal and either using some sort of technology or pedals alongside the saxophone itself. And I've sort of become, throughout my master's, interested in the performance experience beyond sort of the purely physiological and the technical aspects of my playing, so beyond sort of, the general pedagogy that you'd experience when you're in these lessons, talking about exactly how you place the fingers, how you place anything like your tongue position, your throat position. I've sort of become interested in expanding beyond that. And also in the closeness of listening to sound. So like this Slavnik's quote here, interested in sort of the detail of sound and what I'm listening to, what I'm playing. So that sort of brings me to this project, which is, an exploration in sort of my embodied technique and the entanglement between myself and my saxophone. So that's the idea that I've been playing saxophone for a very long time, to a point where my technique becomes embodied and sedimented. And then within that, I get this sort of entanglement between myself and my instrument, where myself and my instrument in these instances can't exist without one another. So first, I suggest, as Tina Krokel's writes, it's about bodies being situated in entanglements, where there isn't a need to separate the human from the non-human, which sort of ties into Scott McLaughlin's ideas and this sort of conceiving of an interdependent and mutually constitutive interplay between human and material agencies, which is where this project sort of becomes about agency and care. And I'll explain a little more how the two, I feel, are tied. But agency here I discuss in Pickering's terms of a dialectic of accommodation and resistance, which I then link to these definitions of care that I'll quickly read for you. So first, most simply, serious attention, especially to the details of a situation or thing. So that's more an idea around, close to the listening practice that I was talking of before of Slavnik's. The process of providing for the needs of someone or something. And then, sort of most crucially to this project is Maggie Nelson's definition, where we treat care as a negotiation of needs that involves assuming strength in the other, resisting the temptation to provide all the answers, inevitable failure and disappointment, allowing for the fact that our desires may chafe against what others want for themselves, and making space for pain, individuation, and conflict without falling apart. So these sort of lead me to a direction where I'm asking, how and where can care be present within my performance practice? What does it mean for myself and my instrument to be partnered or entangled? And how can that interplay between the bodies, the human and the non-human, become caring? For those interested, I've listed some of my research methods and the documentation techniques that I use throughout this and future projects. But I'm not going to delve into that too much at the moment. But what I want to show you now is an example of what's happening when I'm performing in this way. So I've got a couple of minutes that I'm going to talk over and walk you through the practice. What's happening in here, there's a lot of moments of pause and rest, which I see as the first example of accommodation or resistance and then care. It's sort of this idea that I'm constantly working between myself and my instrument to find something that fits and find something that works between the two. And it's drawing away from an idea that things have to be technically perfect to work well within the system. So I'm just going to start this here. In this first clip, you'll see a bit of that stillness that I was just talking about. And then this first example, so you'll see in a second and maybe hear a little bit of a high note start to creep out. And this is drawing to the failure and disappointment, because there's things that aren't happening as instantly as maybe I'd like. But it's also what I'm physically doing is playing a multiphonic, which for those who don't know, a quick explanation is playing multiple notes on the instrument at once. So normally you're supposed to have one note, and here you get multiple notes at once. What this does within the instrument is build a lot of resistance, because that's not technically how the instrument should be played in a standard way. It builds this physical resistance within the instrument, and therefore I'm navigating and accommodating my way around, and sort of coming back to that idea of, failure, disappointment. Then here, this is more an example of this sort of chafing against one another. If I stop talking for a second, you might be able to hear a little bit more easily. There's some beating between the notes. I don't know if you can hear that super well, but what's happening there is the difference between the input sound, the raw audio, and then what's looped. They're sort of beating against one another, and it's an idea that those sounds are resisting each other, and what I'm working against and towards is sort of making those sort of live in a world together, and then resisting, accommodating, and then I use Pickering's words to sort of describe this as like a dance of agency. So it's that idea that this constant accommodating resistancy, it's a dance, and I'm moving towards and against, and just, this constant idea of push and pull. To draw that more towards sort of an emotional and care state, I come to like this Rosenberg and Reardon-Smith quote, that this idea, although here talking about a more collectivized form of sound use and sound use between different people, this idea of the human and the non-human working together, it's creating the interconnectedness between myself and my instrument, and therefore this empathy and this way of sort of seeing a different way of treating a relationship with an instrument beyond sort of classical traditions and training where it might be very much towards the technical. It's sort of expanding beyond that and using my saxophone as a vehicle to expand beyond. Similarly, Matthew Klein has had these experiences in performing Wandelweiser work, which kind of aesthetically is similar to the music I'm playing here. And I just, now sort of come to questioning what other opportunities and applications this might have to other practices, my own practices when I'm performing different types of work, and sort of this idea, of other people's works, such as Davinia Ann Robinson, whose exhibition here, Distinction Between Felt Flesh, is about constant sort of care and repair to these sculptures that are moved and removed throughout her exhibition. So she says they require ongoing gestures of care and repair, which when I was looking at this and comparing my own work, I was wondering if care could therefore be inherent to these durational types of work. To finish, I sort of bring this back to a lot more of a, expansive view, and where a lot of my roots in this project are, is this idea of, bodies and diversity, and how we explore around what's a given, and how we, experiment in what we can imagine and care throughout that. So this Lola Olufemi quote from her book, Experiments in Imagining Otherwise, is sort of my overarching theme throughout this. And here are some references if anyone's interested. Thank you.
Sorry? Okay, now we're back. Thank you for the lovely presentation. And I'm going to begin with a couple of questions to sort of open up some of the themes that you explored with us today. So first, I thought it was very interesting that you referred to Pickering, who himself is a sociologist and like historian of science, and extensively has written about the history of cybernetics. And actually, I sort of decided that this is going to be one of the main frameworks that I would like to try and apply to the different topics today. So I really like this idea that you sort of brought into light, the dance of agency, and exploring this in your own relationship to the instrument and the saxophone. And actually, I would like to ask a question that sort of talks about care imagined as being a force which facilitates what you might consider to be a performer instrument system. So let's try to imagine that you and the saxophone are a cybernetic system, and that care or this sort of negotiation of needs is something that, in a sense, regulates and lubricates the system. So my question here is, firstly, would you agree with this view? And secondly, how do you see this play out in a system where, at least according to Pickering, only the human has intentionality versus agency?
Yeah, I definitely would see that as the theme. I think it's very much, the idea of the interconnectedness is, there's this constant push and pull. And the idea of this dance of agency in Pickering, I'm very thankful to Scott McLaughlin and his research, as he's written about that a lot. And he's sort of drawn from Pickering that there's not so much a difference between the human and the material. And there's agencies within both of those. The saxophone can't act without me, and I can't act in this way without the saxophone. So it's kind of, I think there's more agency within the instrument itself than maybe is immediately obvious, in that, we're both like interdependent and rely on each other in such an act. And I think especially when I'm looking to performing in a way that's revolving around multiphonics or like experimental tuning systems and loop pedals, a lot of these techniques physically, they require a lot more time and accommodation. So therefore I'm sort of, moving around in a way that, the saxophone doesn't really want me to play in this way. So it's sort of pushing and pulling between those two things as well.
Right, actually that was my second question, but you basically answered it, which was mostly about sort of, does the saxophone have needs, and what are the needs of the saxophone? Like, is the breath, the pressure, the technique, and how does this unfold throughout the session? But you basically just tackled this. So maybe I would then like to extend to a slightly larger scale question, which is looking beyond the human instrument dyad and rather including the audience as another element in this system. So could you say that this principle of care as being like the force or the lubricant regulating a system like this also contributes then to a larger, like maybe 3-unit system, including the audience as well?
Yeah, I would say, I haven't researched into this bit so much so far, so my research has mostly been about the personal practice, and that I find in the video example I gave myself one instruction for the improvisation, which was to perform with care, given the 3 definitions I explored. And I think it certainly would be possible, but I don't know within what sort of limitations or like what practicalities do I need to involve the audience within that, or will they, because I see my performing as sort of a feedback loop. I begin with care and then it's a resultant quality, but for an audience to be involved, I sort of am unsure as to whether they need to be sort of in the know and in the loop with that, or if it just is a natural product or natural byproduct,
Right, so it's more kind of open and dependent on the different variables and the input of the audience. Great, okay. Yeah. Well, we are now out of time for the session. Thank you so much. This was really lovely. And yes, I hope that we're going to have more questions about your topic in the final Q&A. Thank you. So now, I would like to present our next presenter, Cynthia, Nkiruka, Anyadi. Cynthia is a PhD student at Royal Holloway, University of London, and her research centers on the cultural significance of memorial souvenirs within Igbo Nigerian communities in Nigeria, Germany, and England. Through 3D modeling and the integration of oral histories, her work aims to create an accessible digital archive that preserves and shares these cultural narratives. Alongside her academic pursuits, Cynthia serves as head of partnerships for Black Geographers CIC, where she leads the 5I Road summer internship program. This initiative provides paid opportunities and networking support for Black students in geography and geoscience, fostering an inclusive academic and professional environment. The mic is now yours, Cynthia.
Hello, hi. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm going to press play. Okay. As you just said, I'm currently a researcher in the Centre for Geohumanities in London, and my work has a specific focus on co-creative and collaborative practices. And so what I wanted to talk about today was things that hold us together, which was the temporary name of my PhD that has kind of stuck around for 4 years. But before I do, I did just want to set a little bit of context to what's going on behind me. I think it felt very strange for me to be up here alone because this project is so fundamentally reliant on so many other people's contributions. And so there will be a lot of faces and spaces and scenes that might not mean that much to you guys, but which are very familiar and dear to me. And they're kind of the building blocks upon which my PhD has been built. So things that hold us together is an exploration of the material and immaterial structures which uphold transnational connections amongst Igbo Nigerians in the UK and London, in Hamburg in Germany, and also in Enugu in Nigeria. And as part of this wider project through my PhD, I specifically explore the interplay of memorial souvenirs, land connections, and spiritual beliefs in maintaining particular connections to people who have been lost, but also to an identity and to a place that has kind of been lost and fragmented through the migration process. And this research has relied on extended oral histories, on photogrammetry, 3D modeling, and on collective, co-creative archival work. And memorial souvenirs, maybe there will be a few that pass up and down through here, but for those who don't know, they're these cheaply made, very cheaply mass-produced objects like key rings and bottle openers, sometimes if you have the money, like an umbrella, and printed on them is usually a photo, the person's name, their birthday, their death date, usually in a very loving way, very tacky. And these objects are not really held preciously like heirloom jewelry or something like that. They're never locked away, they're used every day, and in their utility, they're kind of a way of carrying grief and memory and connection within the home, wherever in the world your home might be. But I'm not actually really talking that much about my PhD today. Mainly I wanted to talk about affection, and I was really glad to have this space and that opportunity to do that because it's a huge theme for me and I never really have the space to talk about it so much. And I am a geographer, and geographers go to great lengths to differentiate between emotion and affect. And so in that vein, I kind of wanted to invite you to join me in a different way of thinking about affect, in a different way of understanding the word affection. Affect fundamentally is a recognition that we experience the world through our interactions. So there's no such thing as experience or action or reaction within a vacuum. And it appreciates that we're shaped not just by the physical, the presence of others, the physicality of our surroundings, but also the immaterial and the unquantifiable, so like ghosts and memories and the weight of expectations, the cultural codes inscribed upon our bodies. And in that way, we can begin to recognize the full expanse of affection as a way of being. So it is yes, love and care, but it's also, love and care and the body that's produced through love and care, But more than that, it's also the impress of another person on oneself. And so affection is necessarily communal. It's almost like it's the space within which we affect and we are affected. And opening up my understanding of affection within my research was really important as a way of recognizing it in places that I hadn't otherwise been able to. The interactions I have with my interlocutors, despite the fact that I've mainly known them for my whole life, are rarely interpreted as spaces of overt love. Generally, it's quite heavy with frustration and anger and confusion and tension. From my side, at least, it's very often laden with expectations and, conversely, disappointment about my language skills, about my upbringing, maybe my lack of husband, lack of cooking skills, this kind of thing. So it's not really the comfort of a typical affection, but affection instead is the space between us, and the intensity of emotion, the weight of a shared history, the investment that we have in one another's lives. I think these are very real and really familiar to me, and I know that learning to appreciate that has been so important in sustaining me throughout these years of research in a way that wasn't possible before this. And so I mentioned earlier that my research uses collaborative photogrammetry as a central method. And for me, it's created a really interesting space to explore affection because it's such a slow, close process. In many ways, it feels like a dance of three bodies. It's myself, my participant, and the memorial souvenir as a placeholder for the deceased. And so holding these three people in one space only occurs because of this use of technology. And I think in the spatial sciences, it's mostly been with like feminist and non-representational turns that the academy has started to really recognize the value of an embodied experience of space, and then also the kind of alternative landscape readings that come with that embodied experience. And it's actually been quite interesting having these conversations and looking at Olia and Lucy's work and how I think we've each fostered spaces to discover affection through the use of novel technologies. And I don't necessarily mean just new devices or new software, but technique in a more philosophical sense, where it's kind of the realization of knowledge within our respective fields through the production of our bodies. And even though our bodies are very different and our audiences of fields are very different, I think that that's a really beautiful way to look at this common thread of affection. And the affective space is then like necessarily very intimate. When I think about my own research and the spaces which are fostered through it, these are not spaces which others would naturally have access to. And I think the knowledge extracted from these spaces is intrinsically bound to the context within which it's produced. And so throughout my PhD, I've really had to contend with how and if I even really want to share these moments and this knowledge publicly. In 2021, I made a short film recording the process of myself and my father, photographing a memorial souvenir. And it was the first and only time I'd recorded this. And I really don't think I could have anticipated the affective weight the camera would have. I think its presence, specifically for the purpose of kind of displaying the space to others, was very overwhelming. And so while my PhD will ultimately culminate in a public archive, I think having some private space between myself and the contributors as part of its creation inspires a certain level of comfort that you don't necessarily need to be so concerned about how you're dealing with one another or what your interactions are, how you can make them digestible for an audience. And so without this thought of impending prying eyes, I think the affective space moves from a public performance to more of an intimate co-production. And there's absolutely an argument that my research suffers for it. I know I've had these conversations with my supervisors. It will probably come up in whatever viva that like maybe my research would be better off for exploring this space in more detail. I obviously disagree. I think there's something actually really profound and very beautiful about how this space is kept between us and that we feel with each other and we feel through each other in quiet moments. And I think that regardless of whether the space is on display, my affections, the affections that are between myself and the people I've worked with, they don't need to be explicitly stated or exposed to be felt in everything that I'm doing. I find particularly like CTM is such an interesting space because in a space for artists and creators, our work is necessarily deeply personal and you're so close to it. And this closeness definitely opens you up to being affected and potentially recipient of affection in ways that we otherwise might not be in a more clinical setting. And there's a vulnerability and a wanting, and often like a part of ourselves and our identity, that was definitely the case for me, that is dependent on the process and the outcome and also the reception. And so rethinking affection, for me, encourages a different way of looking at my work. And I can begin to consider very critically, what affection do I have for it? How do I impress physically and spiritually and emotionally upon it? And how is it shaped and being shaped by me in return? And so I think that I've begun to see affection in gestures and encounters where I otherwise hadn't recognized them. And I've really drawn resolve and energy from this evidence that like this space mattered in a way that I hadn't otherwise felt it had. And actually it's been really nice, I think, putting this presentation together and looking through all this old archival footage from home. And so, yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. So I would like to begin with a question which focuses on the perception of time within the Igbo community. From what I've read, at least, the perception of time with the Igbo is described as cyclical, so sort of with a focus on events recurring and the communal activities as well. So just correct me if I'm wrong. But how does this idea, or generally the Igbo perception of time, influence the way that you think and see affection and care? And how is this expressed within the community? And I know that you talked a lot about space, which is interesting as a geographer, but now I'm also interested in this idea of time and how does the community actually perceive time and what can we learn from them?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because it's definitely, I don't know if it's necessarily so unique to the Igbo community in terms of, in a contemporary sense, how do we hold time with one another? And so I know at the beginning of my PhD, I was like, I'm going to do these interviews and I'm going to sit down and start asking you questions. And everyone I spoke to was like, wait, hold on, like, slow down. We don't need to do this so quickly. And it really resulted in, the interviews that I've done have taken place over like weeks and months and years because people, I think, have an appreciation of the fact that in order to learn something, you need time. You can't do this quick thing where you jump in and you're there for 2 weeks and then you leave. That's like not the way that relationships are built and that's not the way that knowledge is passed along. So I think in that sense, I've really learned a degree of patience in a way that's really nice. But I do know what you mean about this cyclical idea. I definitely think it stems from this particular Igbo spiritual belief system of Ordinala, where life is cyclical and you have these reincarnations over and over again, and you come back to Earth, and eventually you go to your ancestors. And absolutely, while there's currently now amongst younger people not so much uptake of this traditional spiritual belief, I do think that that way of thinking about life does have a cultural impact on how people think about their connections to one another and how those connections span over time rather than everything having to happen like in that moment.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I also very much like engaging in this sort of cyclical view, not just of time, but also nature itself, and seeing the community as a reflection or like as a timekeeping mechanism, and yet again, something that keeps recurring over generations and always changes and yet is the same. And then my second question, although related, is more maybe focused on the linguistics of the Igbo and how the way that they perceive the world and themselves is maybe reflected in some parts of the language, because very often our own cognition is also leaking into the language and the specific expressions that we use. So I'm just curious if you have encountered some maybe interesting expressions or concepts or maybe proverbs that encapsulate the community's way of thinking about care. And what has been your experience with the language?
It's a very heavy topic, and actually it's what I'm writing about right now, because the idea of like an Igbo identity is so tied to language. I know that's true of basically everywhere, but really it's been pressed upon me like throughout my life, and I've really seen it through my research that language and having not even necessarily like you've perfected the language because it's regionally so differently, and in your village it's different to in your town to within the city, but caring about the language I think is important even if you can't speak it. And for me, like, it would even be funny to say I'm not fluent. I'm so unfluent. Like, I just know a little bit here and there, despite spending several months learning. But one thing that I do think, one thing I find really beautiful actually linguistically is this way of looking at the history of the way people name one another, the way they name the world around them. I think that that's this through line that I see where, for example, when I think about my own name or my own last name or the names of the people around me, I think that there's such an important history to it, and there's so much connecting us to one another through that linguistic tradition. And you're asking about proverbs, and I don't really have one that I could draw on. But I do think that there is something that I really knew when I was doing my PhD, that like getting a grasp of the language was ultimately the only way I would be able to have a full understanding. The one thing I do remember is from very early, not even in my PhD, but in my undergraduate dissertation, and I was speaking to someone and she said that every Igbo man, which I would like to correct, say person, but every Igbo person has umuna and obi, which means that everyone has their kin and their home, but obi really means like heart. And so this is really stuck in my head for like 6 years, that every person has the people who love them, but also the place that holds them close. And I think that's, yeah, I remember this always.
That's very beautiful, and I'm sure it's a huge topic to tackle, and we can even address this again when we have our big Q&A. But yeah, language is cool because it doesn't fossilize and it also changes, and yet it still retains some of the ancient ways of cognizing. Thank you very much. That was really fantastic. And now we're going to... And now we come to our third presenter, Olia Sosnovskaya. So, often grounding her work in historical materials and events, popular culture, and personal experiences, she interweaves the notions of festivity and the political, manifested in collective choreographies. She is a member of the artistic research group Problem Collective and the Work Hard, Play Hard working group. Her works were presented at Kunsthalle Wien, Iflux, Tanzquartier Wien, Kiev Biennial, and How, among others. You may have the mic now.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm sorry if I will speak too fast. Yeah. So this project addresses political movement and its effects, in particular exhaustion, and the temporality of revolutionary event through the concept of a movement score. It focuses on collective movements, bodily and political, in where I refer to specific protest choreographies that have been crucial during 2020-21 post-elections uprising in Belarus, and these protest marches, as you see here, or walks, The gathering, such as neighborhood parties and actions, occupations of public space and strikes, and solidarity networks, such as protest telegram chats or initiatives for political prisoners' support. Through these collective choreographies, I attempt to trace transformations in understanding of the political in the context of crisis and forms of social organizing and political agency. Those have been conditioned by the failed projects of state socialism, the consequent neoliberal transformations and installment of authoritarian political regimes in many former Soviet countries, and the current rise of the fascist and imperialist neoliberalisms in the West, which of course affects the rest of the world. And more personally, it departs from the experience of 2020-21 anti-governmental uprising in Belarus and its suppression, and the ongoing repressions against the participants, and which was followed by the ongoing Russia's invasion in Ukraine, supported by Belarusian government with the use of its territory and infrastructures. So drawing from dance theory, archival materials on revolutionary mass celebrations, and various materials for political organizing during the uprising, I understand movement score as any kind of graphic transcript of movement, including text, that intersects multiple temporalities of its enactment. I use it as a conceptual and artistic method for analyzing and composing choreographies and texts. So in dance studies, movement notation is a tool to graphically record, analyze, preserve, and transmit dance and movement. And there are many existent systems of notations. Many of those, or mostly most of them, have been embedded in various systems of power that aimed to precisely map, systematize, and control bodies and territories. For example, Benesh notation inspired establishment of ethnochorology as a field, as a system of colonial knowledge production. The very first movement notation was actually commissioned for the court of the King Louis XIV. Labo notation at some point was used to maximize efficiency in industrial labor, and Eshkol-Wachman notation system was used in US-funded military projects for development of basically remote control robots for military and civilians, and also being ideologically linked to Zionism and Israel's colonial expansion and occupation of Palestine. And from my context, socialist mass choreographies, movement schemes were part of the tradition of socialist revolutionary celebrations that were part of a bigger state ideological project. But in the early 60s, the conceptual and semantic shift from dance notation to scoring happened, which brought a new approach, which implied less stability of meaning and stressed the process of interpretation and agency or agencies of the performers. And also scores were now written rather to generate movement than to document it. As a conceptual and methodological tool, movement scores for me are crucial for the relation to bodies and time. And these are some examples of movement scores. And what's important here is that movement score is reading and writing a score is essentially somatic experience, and it requires physical participation of reader and performer, and scores are also rather collective. And of course, certain aspects of movement should not and cannot be transcribed, so score is less of a acute explanatory or representational tool, but it's rather an outline of possibilities, and also a tool to stress what stays beyond the archive, what's not meant to be shared. And it's always incomplete and unstable, but so is the movement. I also believe that score challenges linearity of time, since it connects the past as a trace or a document with present moment when it's read and embodied, as well as the multitude of its potential future enactment. And in my research on the scores of protest choreographies, I work with routes and plans for protest marches, maps, instructions, guidelines, demands, and other traces and speech acts. Some of them you see here. I'm interested in those tensions between treating those documents and traces as notations, such as a system of knowledge, control, and archiving, or as scores, as a tool to generate movement and agency. I wonder how movement scores of protest choreographies add to the understanding of political movement and event. Unlike notation, which requires precision with a minimum intervention of language and emotion, I wonder if score can incorporate not only language but also affects and intimacy. In here, I'm, for example, interested in the notion of joyful militancy as a capacity to affect and be affected as a necessary condition for political organizing, or how Jen Joy in the choreographic draws on Nancy's understanding of community and Munio's understanding of the aesthetic, claiming that community must be re-choreographed, experienced as sensual, relational flux through ecstatic practice, as a movement out of time or convergence of multiple temporalities against linear straight time. At the same time, speaking from the moment of aftermaths of suppressed revolution in Belarus and then going war in Ukraine, the most recent genocide in Gaza, and multiple crises unfolding globally, I also refer to other kinds of effects. For example, the solidarity of disappointment, as Hannah Proctor puts it in Burnout, as a communal bond in struggles of those the heartbroken after Gargi Bhattacharya, or Douglas Crimp notion of mournful militancy, grief and anger, care and sadness, collectivity and withdrawal that allows people both to care for wounds and attempt to radically transform the society. Going back to protest choreographies, I look at exhaustion in particular as one of the essential characteristics, that is bodily exhaustion of continuous movement, but also exhaustion as post-revolutionary effect. I wonder what can bring to the understanding of dynamics and imaginary of the political organizing, the notion of exhaustion. I claim that when exhausted, the movement serves as the interruption of straight linearity of revolutionary time. As Andrei Levecki puts it, a political movement that must be learned, rehearsed, and in every repetition, through every repetition, renewed. When exhausted, the movement becomes an exercise. Writing about the experience of smashed revolution in Grenada, David Scott addresses the contemporary aporia of the crisis of political time. He claims that rhythms of relation between past, present, and future have been broken or interrupted, and the sense of present as ruined time, the present that stands out in its arrested movement, could be nothing more than the endless repetition, the endless and melancholic repetition of itself. He, however, states that these catastrophic aftermaths have provoked a more acute awareness of time, a more arresting attunement to the uneven topos of temporalities. So I wonder if this interrupted linearity of revolutionary time also have a different potential. Could it be that the stretched out present opens a space of possibility, the present seen as a profound and lasting temporal break, for rehearsing and exercising the future now, an event of, I quote, enduring unfolding of effective connections and effect virus through which new socialities emerge, as Isabel Laurie puts it, or a stretched out time of the music track after Mark Fisher, or pocket in time in which there is more time after Mackenzie's work. Nyada Tanasowski and Kalin Dvora also challenge the afterness, belatedness, and failed or impossible future of post-socialism, instead rethinking it as a queer time, which complements the past conditional temporality of what could have been, as non-unified and propelled by multiple political desires and uncertainties. So what does it mean to treat historical document and event as a score? Does it acknowledge both the untranslatability of the political event, bodily movement and effect, and its possibility to be activated and shared, to bring to the foreground the gaps, ruptures, and stuttering, to embrace uncertainty, contingency, and fragility of political action? Does it allow us to establish more complex temporal and corporal relationships between the political events, archives, and political projects? How long does a revolutionary event last? How long does the effect of the revolutionary event last? What stays in the body after the movement? Exhausted movement continues in a score, unsettling the relationship between past and future, event and the document. Can score of past political movements generate new effects and desires? Can the effect of exhaustion sustain intimate connections among the disassembled collective movements in the aftermath of the political event? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Olia. I'll give you a moment. You actually finished slightly before time, so we're good.
Down in the end a bit.
Okay, so actually I thought about, in parallel as you were speaking, about a couple of studies that I've encountered a few years ago, which basically hooked up people to different heart rate monitors and even portable EEGs while they were at raves. And they looked at the synchronization of bodies during such a collective action and actually found that in events like raves, for example, or different kinds of choreographies, even musical performances, people's heart rates and also brain waves synchronize. So on this physiological level, we have synchronization, and then of course, in the behavioral level, there's also synchronization of bodies. So I'm just curious, have you maybe encountered any kind of studies like this, perhaps that focus on political movements and physiology? And have you thought about this? If not, how does this inform your approach to this topic?
Yeah, I encountered only, I think, the study about bodily rhythms, which didn't mention any kind of technological study of heartbeat, but was more like speculating around rhythm at festivals, but also different kinds of rhythms within the body. But I think, basically the experience of rave informs my research, and the research started as my interest in the tension between politics and festivity as organized from top down, as in this Soviet celebrations, but also like the contemporary Belarusian state continues this tradition, but also the affective or festive aspect of protests and in self-organized celebrations and raves, this politics from below, but also, and also what kind of if, for example, this like state parades, but also the history of failed protests is this kind of politics that people started to distance themselves from, in my context at least, and then could like rave or festive practices be this another kind of politics that opens up imaginaries and offer another ways of connecting. But also I'm very critical of romanticization of rave or like celebration, and also the idea of unity. What I'm interested in is these approaches to collectivity, which would not speak about like unification or necessarily synchronization, but also could encompass all like failed, like I don't know, imperfect solidarities, as this new book, a recent book of Andrea de Souza, I think, is called, or different kinds of discrepancies, agencies, like Tina Kamp's critique of solidarity and proposing adjacency, and so on and so forth. And also what kind of material conditions stand beyond these possibilities of collectively organize or impossibility to organize.
Cool. Yeah, I also think it's very interesting, this interaction between sort of raves or some kind of musical festivities and political organization, large scale, because quite often you would see that these interact in different ways and kind of like then further moralize the people or sort of stimulate the crowd to gather around the cause. And music has always been this kind of lubricant in many, many different contexts. So then a second question that I would like to ask, again, kind of looking at biology, but maybe a bit from a different angle, because you mentioned your interest in sort of this concept of exhaustion and trauma as being stored in the body. And again, there's been quite a bit of studies looking at the epigenetics and sort of how different elements that relate to certain genes but are not specifically genetic material actually can be transmitted over generations. Like, for example, there was a famous study that looked at Holocaust survivors and their descendants, and essentially found that the genes regulating stress have been completely modified even in further generations. So there's this intergenerational trauma. So I wonder, how do you then approach this idea of trauma being stored in the body, and how does exhaustion then come into play, especially for the future generations?
I think for me also this is important when we think about time, and also this idea of future as like something positive, which now been overshadowed by like this catastrophic futures. And I think also what you said about generational traumas. There is this notion of black pessimism, for example, and also this people from the places and communities that experience generational trauma also been critical of the notion of hope and opposing like hope to desire, for example, as my colleague and comrade Nurshan too have been writing recently about, that how also this hope being actually maybe a privilege of people who never experienced generational traumas, but also how I'm like looking specifically how then the like regimes of power are instrumentalizing this hopelessness and basically saying like, okay, nothing has never happened because this kind of cynical approach, which I also resist. And I think what's important is not to become like too romantic or too naive about the possibilities of global revolution, but still continue to demand it. And that's why these notions of joyful militancy or mournful militancy, which acknowledge both like the exhaustion or impossibilities, but also still generates this desire to continue building like some connections or practices. And also basically I'm trying to look at exhaustion as also a source. If we are in this, if exhaustion is a shared state, what it can actually generate.
Yeah, and that's also very interesting to again think about cybernetic systems and exhaustion of a system. Really, is there a sort of limit that a system reaches, and what happens when we go past that limit? Then do we restart another cycle, or does this push into a different type of behavior? I guess that's quite open and speculative.
Yeah, and maybe just like from my personal experience of dancing, like in like dance, not in the raves, but yeah, actually this like exhaustion which rave brings, like this post-rave exhaustion, I think is something very, could be also pleasurable. Or for example, from my experience of doing dance classes also, there is always this, after exhaustion, there is like another source of energy. Though of course, I'm not like advocating exhaustion because it's also, a part of this white supremacist extractionist machine of exhausting resources from bodies and lands. So it's like always this tension.
Exhaustion is exhausting. We know that. Okay, great. Thank you so much for now addressing these questions. And actually, I'm going to ask you to stay here and invite the other participants now for a Q&A all together. So we are going to begin with a couple of sort of opening questions among us, and then I'm going to open the questions also to the audience. So please stay tuned. Okay, so as we have already discussed quite a lot, we addressed cybernetic systems and sort of cybernetic thinking. And on the one hand, we dealt with ideas that are coming from sort of control theory and computers and are very sort of mathematical in its nature, like feedback, adaptation, even self-organization. But then on the other hand, the theme is affection, and quite a lot we talked about these somehow human concepts of desire, maybe exhaustion, needs that tend to be a bit more psychobiological, so to say. So if we consider things like political movements or even like instrument improvisation, or even go beyond to address like knowledge sharing and diasporic sort of organization, and see all of these as sort of cybernetic systems of care, is there room to conceptualize these systems as having desires or needs? Or do you think this would be just a sort of anthropomorphization of feedback loops? So how do we balance this bias towards thinking about very human things like needs and desires, and yet trying to find a sort of systems approach at the same time? So I guess that's open to all of you if you want to say something. or in general, how do you deal with human bias in your research?
I guess maybe to start, that within my work there's a huge amount of human bias and my own bias in my own playing, and practice research especially has this large amount of bias that you can't always sort of mitigate, but like have an awareness of and write about as part of the practice. I think that's something sort of very apparent in my work at the moment, and how I'm trying to move forwards is acknowledging what needs to be acknowledged and kind of expressing that it's a very personal view, and I hope through that there maybe opens up more opportunities beyond my own human experience. But it's a hard one to navigate, I think.
Yes.
I guess it's, I am really open to, and I really like the idea of looking for humanity or emotion or desire, these things that we understand in places that maybe we wouldn't expect to find them. But I do think it's quite interesting, for example, like Lucy, you talking about yourself and your saxophone, and your saxophone is very alive to you, and you're kind of having this feedback with one another, and it's kind of emotional, it's physical. And I, for example, because I'm not like a photographer by trade or by any means, I think it's really interesting that you have that with your saxophone. I don't have that at all with my camera. Like, usually it's like 40 degrees and the camera's shutting down and everything's going wrong, and I don't humanize it in the same way that you do. So I think it's also contextual and circumstantial how we place those systems upon the non-human objects around us.
Cool. So now maybe just to sort of continue on this human bias, so to say, because on the one hand it is a bias, but on the other hand it's also an inspiration for us all to think about technology with our own sort of thinking around psychology and affect. And it's interesting to consider that even humans as a species are a hyper-cooperative species. And what really makes us successful in like a very ecological sense of the word is our hyper-cooperativity. So I think that it's very interesting to consider how something this ancient as the even wiring of our own brain and behavior then leaks into the way we think about things. And it makes me think of sort of animism and generally like the tendency to attribute agency to non-human things. So I guess continuing this kind of naturalization of affection and technology, I wonder if you interacted with the history of this kind of thinking of inanimate things in your own research, and how does it apply? Perhaps maybe more relevant to your sort of anthropological approach. Did you think about animism as a sort of force that influences affection in this kind of research?
Maybe not animism, but definitely like the fetishization of objects is something that I've been thinking about, or like is kind of core within cultural geography. And that to me is really interesting, how something that is maybe totally meaningless to you has so much depth and so much meaning to me. And as I've been over these past weeks kind of looking through archival footage, even kind of the stuff I was drawing on from this, and looking back at old conversations, and there was one particular interview I was looking at where someone had been saying these words in loving memory, which were printed on this like very faded mug, and he was saying, this means something different to me than it means to the wife, than it means to the kids, than it means to whoever's been given this as they've passed through the village, through this funeral. And I think there's something really amazing. I know when I was first introduced to this idea of like, having multiple meanings and like the double fetish and all of this, it really changed my way of looking at the world and recognizing, wow, like a shoe is not a shoe, or like a glass of water is not a glass of water, and that I think is a really amazing way of opening up. Like you were saying, these systems that we try and put in place, I think it has it has a way of broadening that and giving you more ways of imagining the world and more ways of imagining the connections.
Right, and relating also, like I like this term of relationality. Now I would maybe like to also address this question to all of you, but perhaps a bit of a different perspective, since these are quite different topics, and yet the overarching thread is affection and care. So I'm just curious, were there any pieces of fiction or a particular sort of art piece? I know you closed with one very particular piece, but beyond that, were you inspired by fiction and in particular science fiction when approaching your work? And if so, what was your sort of main inspiration?
I'm always happy to talk a bit more about Lola Olufemi's book, which kind of flicks between fiction and non-fiction. And the quote that I ended with actually is from a fictitious section of the book where the characters are sort of talking about a new life and new world and imagining that and growth and how we sort of move through these things, and how sort of the book sort of discusses how to experiment in your thought and not just methods, but yeah, it's sort of a proposition and a vehicle to do so, which I guess is kind of where I land and start with my work. Is sort of, it's just a vehicle for this expression, and it doesn't have to be me and my saxophone exactly, but how that can be applied elsewhere. That's, yeah.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah, I don't read so much fiction, unfortunately, but I think in general I'm interested in various texts and effects of language and effects of texts, and yeah, I can think about poetry, but also I also like to read I don't know, theory or diaries or even some like bureaucratic texts and see what kind of effects this kind of writing produces, and also yeah, maybe going back to your questions that I'm like I wonder why I come back to some like archival materials over and over again, or like these movement notations, which I also I don't have, like I'm very critical of, and I know like there are systems of power, so it's also something that I can say I hate, but still why is it like stuck with me? So yeah, I'm thinking about this relationship of yeah, with certain documents also, and how the documents can have like their agency also in the future, and especially when people that have been like part of producing them or which had impact on their lives are no longer in one place. It's like this disassembled collectivity, and which also probably is relevant for your work.
I think this is, just to quickly add, a very interesting notion, because you interacted with such different types of documents in your research, and you mentioned like bureaucratic documents that, you know, maybe at the time were written by a certain sort of biased entity holding power in that moment. And yet, if you were to then revisit these documents later with your own perspective, you can see how the nature of the potential of this document becomes emancipatory depending on what your intention is. So it's kind of going back to what we talked about, this interaction between the player and the instrument, or sort of the actor and the network, which is what distinguishes the two, is that humans are the ones who have the intentionality, and they walk into this collaboration or sort of interaction with an intention. And of course, the objects can have different types of agency, but intentionality is something that I think like defines the nature of the agency and how then the result looks like. For example, like a bureaucratic document that changes its nature through your interaction. So, did you want to add something?
No, I was just going to add, I'm maybe the opposite in that I really love reading fiction, and it's been a really important part of my research process. I think particularly when you're working in a context like I am, where those voices and those stories have not been represented in academia, are still not really represented in academia, and storytelling is such a hugely important part of the history and of the documentation of history. And I'm not someone who necessarily thinks that fiction means lies. I think that fiction is a different way of telling the truth. And definitely for me, something that was very important was Orchestra of Minorities by Chigozie Obiom. And it was a really interesting way of visualizing time. It's like it comes back to what you were saying, this like cyclical lifetime, looking at or trying to understand what does that actually look like? How can I imagine time in a different way to the way I've been doing it myself?
Thank you so much. And with this, I would like to now open the questions to the audience as well. So do we have any questions for our participants?
Thank you so much. First of all, it has been, wow, super stimulating and mind-blowing, all of your researches, and the passion that you put into it. I'm not sure if this is a question as much as perhaps a reflection to Lucy's work, but I was thinking about this master-slave dynamics that exist within our language that is so inherent to Western culture that reinforces our separatedness basically from everything from the living world, and puts us somehow in this like hierarchical pyramid to the top because we are able to speak. So I don't know, it just seems like we're separate from anything else. So I just thought like your connection to, it's even strange that I have to use the word instruments, right? Like tools to create sound somehow seem to diminish this hierarchy. And I see affection as a non-hierarchical process, sort of. But I really appreciated also this idea that affection is about affecting and being affected, and it is not always something that is positive, but it is actually something that can be troublesome or frustrating. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's actually very relevant to a lot of the themes that I spoke about with my supervisor as well, in that sort of, one, there's this a lot in sort of Western classical music, this idea that there's a performer who just does what's on a page, and it's sort of this idea of you just do what you're told, and there's always these things of, oh, this is the way to play this Beethoven piece, and this is the way to play this piece by this composer. And it's, I guess, yeah, just in being improvisation, moving slightly away from that, but also, yeah, the idea of the effect and the affection, I think I spoke about with my supervisor a lot, and I remember her saying to me quite early on, you know, it's still like there's the push and pull, and even though there's this affection and care, it maybe removes the hierarchy, but it doesn't remove the sort of life from it, in the sense that, you know, there's something wrong about thinking everything will always be soft and nice and we're only ever going to experience things in those ways. And that's sort of how that push and pull comes into it, I think, in that, I'm aiming within it to remove that sort of hierarchy, but still keep the life and that dialectic.
Any other questions, comments, contributions?
Thank you so much for the great presentations. My question goes to you, Cynthia, because I was wondering, you mentioned during your research process when you do those interviews, you have to hold space for yourself, for the person who you are talking to, and to the object. And I was wondering, what is the role of the technology you're using in your research? So what type of agency or space that technology holds, let's say, or what you have to also hold space for that technology? That would be my question when you talk about photogrammetry or when you're recording interviews and so on. So the role of the technology itself.
I think it's definitely changed quite a lot over the years, especially when I was first new to it. I was so focused on the object looking perfect in production that it took over the whole process. I wasn't really thinking about the conversation we were having. I wasn't thinking about those moments that we had together. I was more just thinking, like, are they getting the angles that I need to get? And is the lighting correct? And I think I ultimately realized, especially with the nature of the objects that I'm trying to photograph, they're never going to be perfect. Like a smooth, white, shiny surface is not going to come out in the way that I might wish it to, particularly if we're in conditions where I have no electricity, so I can't use a light box, and it's too hot to take the photos for much longer than 10 minutes, and all of these things. And so definitely getting to a space, I think, particularly after my first round of producing those models, where I realized, okay, it doesn't need to be perfect, it's actually fine. And these representations that might go into a public archive, that's not ultimately the worth or the purpose of this exercise that we're doing together. And it's much more important for me to set that technology to the side and look at it as a tool for facilitating this interaction, but not the be-all and end-all of what we're doing together. And I think that I'm relatively lucky with my with the field that I'm working in, where they're not necessarily going to be judged in the same way it might be for someone else, and that I'm able to look at it as a tool rather than to have to maintain this hyper-focus. But definitely it's changed over time, and I'm quite glad the trajectory with which it's changed, because I really noticed a big difference in the quality of what we were co-producing with one another when I stopped looking at technology or like at this photogrammetry process as the heart of it, because it was not really the heart of it.
Thank you.
Any other audience questions, thoughts? If not, maybe I can... Oh, wait, I see. There's a hand.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for your presentations, because in my mind, it felt like there are some doors opened for me, and I'm really thankful for that. I have a question also for Lucy, and I would like to know if the bond you have with your instrument, the connection, where does it come from? Do you think it's maybe influenced by the way you were taught or introduced to the instrument when you were younger, or do you think it is independent from what kind of instrument you play, but with a certain level of expertise, you just have this connection to your instrument? Because I feel like many people don't feel that the way you feel, and I just want to where does it come from? Is it a personal thing, or is it a is it just something you have to work towards on or something?
Yeah, I think a mix in, coming to express it in the way that I do is very much from reading Ben Spatz's work. He talks about embodiment as like technique and sedimented within the body. And I think that sort of really helped me to articulate it in the way I do. I think my connection with the instrument more in a personal sense, I think, it comes partly from time and like my upbringing. I was surrounded with a lot of music. But I think also through sort of navigating like the way that we're often taught, like Western classical music. So I was taught saxophone in a more classical sense growing up. And it didn't always quite fit and suit how I wanted to play. And there were things about the way you play and sort of the way you're taught that, you know, you must hold your fingers in this exact position and you must be aware of, the openness of the throat and things that didn't quite work for me in the same way that I was being told. And I think it was really a way for me to sort of continue and open up my musical language in a way that I wanted to express it, to sort of move beyond. I started working with like loop pedals and stuff during the pandemic, and that sort of really opened up the ways of playing that I would experience and sort of moved me a little bit away from all the, like, I think, some of the technique I was taught is very important to me, but being able to move slightly away from it and prioritize different things is sort of what opened me up to that.
Anyone else? I think we have time for one more question. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Olia, and this is about the notion of joyful militancy and generally the research and like ways to implement the research in real life, because histories of protests have been quite a big thing in the last, decade or something, in Russia, in Belarus, and like other places that I'm less aware of. And I wonder, the notion of exhaustion is like a real thing that also I kind of experienced through media or like by real participation. So I wonder whether you're planning to scale your research towards some sort of, let's say, tips, but let's be careful with this notion, or like you would rather stay very much in your field of researching and linking it to movement and other topics that you mentioned. I hope this makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. You mean tips for protests? Or?
Yeah, basically kind of becoming an activist through the research. Maybe some insights would like kind of guide you towards some, maybe you're like still hesitant about it, but like whether you have been considering this.
Yeah, I think I'm very cautious about sharing any tips in the field of academia and in general, so it's like not being instrumentalized, but like I don't want to share knowledge of resistance with the police, for example. Or also, like I'm very cautious how academia is like extracting certain knowledges of resistance and experiences of resistance, and then silencing the actual resistance in its field. So, for example, with the academy I'm part of, I don't want to share much, like Vienna Art Academy. But also, I think, there is a lot of actual activist work which has been done, and I also, in my work, try to separate my experience of being part of political movements, which of course informs my artistic practice and my academic practice, but I'm very critical of the figure of artist activist. Yeah, and because anyway, like art and academia brings certain social capital, and I think what I'm now struggling with in my work, that I'm talking about collective legacies and collective knowledge and the collective experience, but how then I can incorporate those voices in the research, which will be then published by my name. Yeah, and that's why I think this notion of score is important for me, because it can challenge this authorship and it could be shared, but also, of course, I'm not going to write like scores for successful protests. And I think yeah, the way of writing for me now is more like this way of processing like what happened and what to do in this like moment, how to make sense of it, and it's been maybe kind of therapeutic. Yeah, but also I think it's very, of course, there are very similar tendencies or parallel between different protests in the world, but also all of them are very specific. And for example, like I'm very curious why Maidan worked, or like how it worked and didn't work in certain ways, and why and how protests in Belarus worked or didn't work, or like everywhere. This just to speak about Eastern Europe, but also in other spaces. And I think it's like actually. Of course, a lot depends on individual actions and like individual militancy, but also it's not like it's a lot of like interconnected systems of power, which to challenge which we really need to like think through another kinds of strategies. I guess, yeah.
Thank you. I would like to thank now all the presenters for the really incredible and interesting presentations, and I really enjoyed having these conversations with you and sort of broadening a lot of the themes that we encountered, and hopefully we're going to think about that even further and talk about it more. And also thank you to the audience for engaging with us. And with this, we close the current module. Thank you so much, everyone.